The rain has a way of remembering. It carries the names of those the world tried to forget, washing over the cities they once ruled, whispering their stories to anyone still awake enough to listen. Tonight it falls on Miami. A city built on sunshine, lies, and cocaine. A place where one woman, barefoot, broke, and born from the slums of Cartagena, rose to power not by mercy but by fear. They called her La Madrina, the Godmother. She ruled an empire of white dust and red streets, moving between luxury and blood with the grace of a saint and the cruelty of a god. But every empire has its storm, and hers began with a single drop of rain. So lie back, close your eyes, let the rain fall, and I'll tell you a story about the woman who taught Miami how to bleed. The rain was constant in Cartagena, as if the city itself never stopped mourning. It came without warning, thick as smoke, coating the rusted roofs and washing the blood from the streets. When it fell, the alleys turned to rivers of mud, and the sea beyond the port bled into the sky until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. In a slum not far from those docks, under a roof made of patched tin and driftwood, a girl was born in 1943. Her mother named her Griselda, a name heavy with old Catholic hope, but there was nothing holy about the world she entered. Her mother worked the night streets. Her father was a rumor that changed depending on who was telling it. The midwife wiped the baby's face, looked into those black, watchful eyes and muttered, "She's already angry." The anger grew with her. By 6, Griselda had stopped asking questions no one would answer. She learned to read faces faster than she learned to read words. The men who came to the door brought rum, noise, and fists. Her mother slept through it all. When one of those men locked her outside during a storm because she'd talked back, she waited in the rain without a sound. Hours later, when he opened the door, she stared up at him with such cold defiance that he struck her again, then hesitated as though he'd seen something too sharp for a child to possess. That was the first time fear shifted sides. Griselda discovered early that the world respected hunger only when it looked like strength. She stole fruit from vendors and coins from pockets. At the marketplace, she watched the rich children buy sweets wrapped in bright paper while she chewed on stolen bread. In the slums, she became part of a pack of street kids who called themselves Los Fantasmas, the ghosts. They slept in abandoned houses, moved through the markets like whispers, and trusted no one. At night, she would lie on her back beneath the cracked ceiling of her shack and listen to the city breathe. There was always noise, music from the cantina, a baby crying somewhere, waves breaking against the harbor wall. She dreamed of the sea because it was the only thing larger than her hunger. Some nights she imagined her father was a sailor, lost at sea but returning with gold. On darker nights she hoped he was dead. Hope, she had learned, was a kind of cruelty the poor couldn't afford. By the age of 11 she'd already buried the last trace of childhood. The moment came without warning, quick, brutal, and permanent. The boy's name was Martin, the son of a shopkeeper. He was the kind of boy who had shoes that never lost their shine and hands too soft for work. He liked to mock her whenever she passed. "Orphan," he'd say, laughing. "Street rat." One afternoon, Griselda decided the world would be better without his laughter. She and 2 other children grabbed him near the docks and dragged him into an empty warehouse that smelled of salt and machine oil. They gagged him with a rag and waited until the sun began to die behind the horizon. The plan was simple: demand a ransom, enough to buy food for a week, maybe 2. But when the message reached the shopkeeper, no one came. The man thought it was a joke. "Poor kids didn't kill," he said. "They begged, they stole, but they didn't kill." Griselda waited for hours. The boy cried until his voice cracked. One of her friends whispered that they should let him go. She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled a pistol from beneath her dress, a soldier's gun she had stolen weeks before. It was too heavy for her hands, the metal slick with sweat. She pointed it at the boy's face. When the shot rang out, the sound filled the whole warehouse, bouncing off the walls like thunder. The boy fell without a word. The others ran. Griselda didn't move. Smoke curled from the gun, and in the fading light she could see the dark stain spreading beneath his body. It was her first lesson in power. It came not from mercy but from silence. That night she walked home as if nothing had changed. The rain started again, washing away the footprints behind her. Her mother asked where she had been. "Nowhere," she said, and went to bed. She slept soundly for the first time in her life. The next day the police came to the neighborhood. They asked questions, made threats, offered rewards. Nobody answered. In places like Cartagena, silence was the only law that mattered. The boy's body was buried, his name soon forgotten. But not hers. People began to look at her differently, not with pity but with a wary kind of respect. The kind usually reserved for men with knives. From that point on, her path was set. Griselda started working for small-time criminals who ran smuggling routes between the docks and the markets. She carried packages she didn't open, delivered envelopes she didn't read. The money was small, but it was hers. She learned to lie, to listen, to disappear. By 13 she had a reputation. By 14 she was feared. She was not beautiful in the way other girls were. She was sharper. Men were drawn to her because she was dangerous. They mistook her silence for submission until they saw what hid behind it, a mind already calculating the next move. The city was changing too. American soldiers passed through, chasing rum and women. The streets buzzed with foreign money and new kinds of greed. Cartagena had always belonged to those willing to take, and Griselda understood that better than anyone. One evening she stood by the sea, watching ships prepare to leave for Panama and New York. The sunset burned red behind the cranes. In that light she could almost imagine herself as someone else, someone clean, untouched, free. But that was a fantasy for fools. She had no family to hold her, no name to protect, no reason to stay. Only a hunger that outgrew the city. When a smuggler offered her passage north in exchange for silence about a murder she'd witnessed, she didn't hesitate. She packed what little she owned, a stolen shawl, a knife, and a coin she'd kept since childhood. That was all she needed. The night she left, the air smelled of salt and rain. The port was alive with shouts and lanterns swinging in the dark. She walked up the plank without looking back. The waves slapped against the hull, the sound deep and slow like a heartbeat. As the ship drifted from the dock, the city shrank behind her, its lights flickering like dying stars. On the open water, she stood alone on the deck, her shawl whipping in the wind. Somewhere behind her, thunder rolled across the sea. She didn't flinch. She smiled instead, a small, private smile meant for no one. The storm outside matched the one she carried within. The girl from Cartagena was gone. What remained was something colder, something that had already learned how to rule. In time the world would know her name. For now it belonged to the rain. The ship left Cartagena behind like a fading dream. 4 days, the sea stretched in every direction, gray, endless, merciless. Griselda stayed mostly below deck, sleeping among sacks of coffee beans and crates filled with contraband liquor. The other passengers whispered about her. A girl traveling alone meant trouble, and trouble was something she carried like perfume. When the ship docked near Barranquilla, she disappeared before dawn, blending into the crowd of dockworkers and traders. No papers. No family. No trace. Just another ghost moving south toward Medellín, the city everyone said was rising. Medellín in the 1950s was a beast waking from its slumber. Factories buzzed. The rich built homes on the hillsides, far from the dust of the working class. The air smelled of metal, tobacco, and ambition. Beneath the polished surface, another city pulsed, one that lived in alleys under bridges in the glow of cheap cantinas. It was a city where a girl could vanish, and where vanishing could be the start of something. Griselda arrived with nothing but a knife and the memory of rain. She rented a cot in a room behind a butcher's shop, paying in coins she had lifted from sailors. The floorboards were warped, the air thick with the stench of blood and smoke. But it was hers. She learned the rhythms of the new city quickly. Children her age sold cigarettes to factory men. Women with painted lips leaned in doorways, calling to soldiers and drunks. And in the back rooms, men in fine shirts whispered about shipments, routes, and things that crossed borders unseen. Griselda started as a runner, carrying messages between taverns, hiding small packages under her clothes. No one paid attention to a girl. That was her advantage. She memorized faces, voices, the smell of danger before it entered a room. She began to understand the invisible rules: who you paid, who you feared, who you killed. There was a man named Carlos Trujillo, older, charming in the way street kings often are, too confident, too smooth. He sold stolen watches, ran gambling tables, and always had cash when others were begging. He noticed Griselda early. Maybe it was her eyes, the way she never looked away. Maybe he saw in her the same hunger that burned through him. They became partners before they became lovers. He taught her how to bluff, how to cheat, how to make people believe what they wanted to hear. She watched and learned, not just his tricks but his weaknesses. Carlos liked to boast. He liked to be feared but never understood what real fear cost. Together they ran small cons, fake passports, counterfeit jewelry, smuggling liquor across provinces. For a while they made money. Enough to buy silk dresses and a gold chain she wore even while sleeping. For the first time, Griselda had something close to power. But she also learned how fragile it was. One night, in a bar called El Paraíso, Carlos brought another woman, younger, prettier, with the soft arrogance of someone who thought danger was a game. Griselda sat in the corner, her drink untouched, watching him laugh. When he caught her staring, he winked. It was the last mistake he ever made. A few days later, he vanished. No one asked too many questions. In Medellín, people disappeared all the time. Some said he left town. Others whispered that he crossed someone more ruthless than himself. Griselda never confirmed anything. She simply wore his gold chain afterward, the same one he'd once refused to lend her, and never took it off. When friends asked what happened, she said, "He went south." They didn't ask where. After Carlos, she no longer pretended to be part of someone else's story. She was building her own. She gathered a small crew, boys from the slums who owed her favors, women who knew how to move unnoticed through checkpoints. Together they smuggled cigarettes, whiskey, stolen guns. Every deal brought her closer to something bigger, the whisper of a trade more profitable than anything she'd touched before: cocaine. The first time she saw it, she didn't understand the power it held. It looked harmless, fine, white, almost beautiful under lamplight. But when she watched a man trade a handful of powder for more money than she'd seen in a year, she knew. This was the future. And she wanted it. Still, she was smart enough to wait. The big operations were run by men with armies, men who'd crush anyone too ambitious too soon. So she kept to the shadows, learning how the trade worked, who controlled which routes, who was weak, who could be bought. In a city built on greed, information was worth more than bullets. Her reputation began to spread. They called her La Viudita, the little widow. No one knew where the nickname came from, but it stuck. Men laughed at it at first until they realized those who crossed her tended not to laugh again. She wore her silence like armor. While others shouted and bluffed, she watched. While they fought over coins, she counted dollars. By the time most realized how dangerous she was, it was already too late. Medellín was changing fast. New faces from the coast brought new goods, cocaine refined in hidden labs, smuggled out through Panama and Venezuela. The trade was small but growing, like a seed that would soon devour the forest. Griselda knew she was standing at the edge of something vast. She started sending messages north, through sailors and smugglers she'd met years before. There were rumors of a place where money flowed like water: New York City. A city that never slept, never forgave, never asked where you came from as long as you had something to sell. She wanted to see it. She wanted to own it. One evening, she stood on the balcony of a cheap hotel overlooking the city. The sky was the color of rust. The streets below flickered with the glow of neon signs and cigarette tips. She could hear music from every window: boleros, jazz, the pulse of a city that never truly rested. In the distance, thunder rolled across the valley. It sounded like applause. She took a sip of cheap rum, leaned on the railing, and thought of Cartagena. The rain, the hunger, the boy whose name she never said out loud anymore. All of it had led her here, to this mountain city that smelled of steel and smoke. And now, she knew it was time to leave again. Some people are born to wander. Others are born to conquer. Griselda Blanco had never been either. She was born to rule. When the call finally came, a smuggler offering her a route into Queens, New York, she didn't hesitate. She sold what she owned, packed her few possessions, and burned the rest. The night before her departure, rain returned to Medellín. It came down hard, drumming against the rooftops, washing the streets clean of dust and sins. She stood by the window listening to it. Rain had followed her all her life, from Cartagena to here, as if the sky itself refused to forget her. The next morning she disappeared again. No one saw her board the plane. No one saw her leave. But in the bars of Medellín, people still whispered her name. They said the little widow was heading north. They said America didn't know what was coming. And they were right. The first thing she noticed about New York was the noise. It wasn't the sound of rain or ocean or even traffic. It was human, relentless, alive. Horns, voices, sirens, radios, everything competing to exist at once. The air smelled like gasoline and ambition. It made her dizzy. When Griselda stepped off the plane, she was 21 years old with forged papers, a new name, and no fear. The customs officer barely looked at her passport. She smiled softly, lowering her gaze the way she'd learned to in Medellín. He stamped the page and waved her through. Just like that, the girl who had murdered a boy in Cartagena and buried a lover in Medellín became someone else, a young Colombian immigrant starting a better life. She arrived in Queens, in a neighborhood that pulsed with the sounds of Spanish and English colliding. Small grocery stores, Catholic shrines behind dirty windows, and the distant rhythm of salsa leaking from radios. The winter wind cut through her thin coat. Snowflakes melted against her hair. She had never seen snow before. For a moment she stood still, her breath white against the air, watching it fall. It was beautiful. It was also cold, cruel, and uninviting. Just like the city itself. Her first home was a room above a bodega owned by an old Cuban named Roberto who didn't ask questions as long as rent was paid. The room was small, with peeling wallpaper and a single window facing an alley. From there she could see other windows, other lives, stacked on top of one another. Families eating dinner, couples fighting, babies crying. The city felt infinite, but every wall was thin enough to hear through. Griselda found work selling stolen jewelry from door to door. She spoke little English, but charm needed no translation. When men tried to touch her, she smiled like she didn't notice. When women eyed her with suspicion, she complimented their hair or their children. The streets were dangerous, but she moved through them with the calm confidence of someone who had already survived worse. She met other Colombians at night, dock workers, smugglers, the kind of men who always had a little too much cash and too many secrets. Among them was Alberto Bravo. Alberto was different from Carlos Trujillo. He wasn't loud. He wasn't careless. He was sharp, like a knife you could mistake for jewelry until it cut you. He dressed well, spoke softly, and smiled rarely. He saw in her what others didn't, potential that scared him and drew him closer all at once. They began working together, first small things then larger. He had contacts back in Bogotá, and she had courage that bordered on madness. Together they started smuggling cocaine into the United States in amounts too small for the police to notice but too steady to ignore. At the time, cocaine wasn't the empire it would later become. It was exotic, mysterious, a rich man's thrill sold quietly in clubs and backrooms. Griselda saw what others didn't. She saw scale. She saw destiny. They started with clever tricks. Cocaine sewn into the linings of dresses. Hidden inside hollowed-out shoes. Even stuffed into baby diapers that no one dared search. Each trip was a gamble, but she never flinched. When one courier panicked at the airport, she pulled the girl aside, whispered in her ear, and smiled. The girl calmed instantly. Later, when they landed, the courier asked what she had said. "Nothing," Griselda replied. "Just that if she got caught, I'd kill her first." The girl never panicked again. Alberto admired her precision. He began to trust her more than anyone else. And with trust came power. She started handling the money, counting, washing, investing. She bought fake companies, opened storefronts that sold nothing but laundered dreams. By 24, she was living in a small house in Queens with rugs imported from Colombia and a closet full of fur coats that made her laugh every time she touched them. At night, she would sit on the windowsill and smoke, looking down at the frozen street. The city below moved like a living creature, never sleeping, always hungering. She understood it. New York was built on ambition and fear, the same currency she'd been trading all her life. The danger grew quietly. The more money they made, the more people wanted a piece. One night, a man from another crew tried to rob their stash house. He didn't get far. Griselda's guards found him tied up in the basement, begging in broken Spanish. Alberto hesitated. She didn't. She walked up to the man, kneeled beside him, and whispered, "You should have learned our language." Then she pulled the trigger. Alberto watched her, expressionless. He said nothing. But that night, when they lay together, he touched her like someone who understood exactly what she was. Something beautiful, lethal, and impossible to control. As months turned into years, their operation grew. Shipments increased. Contacts expanded. They moved beyond Queens into Manhattan, Miami, and Los Angeles. Griselda traveled constantly, always under new names, always one step ahead of the police. Her face appeared in no photos. Her name existed in no records. She had become a rumor, an urban legend whispered among traffickers. But power had its own cost. The money brought envy. The business brought enemies. And the violence she thought she'd left behind in Colombia began to follow her. There were shootings in nightclubs, betrayals in warehouses, deals that ended in silence. One afternoon, she found Alberto sitting at their kitchen table, staring at a newspaper. The headline spoke of Colombian narcotics networks and federal investigations. His hands trembled slightly. He said, "We should stop. For a while." Griselda poured herself a drink. "People who stop," she said quietly, "get forgotten." She took a sip, her eyes cold. "I didn't come to America to be forgotten." In 1968, when the first major DEA sweep hit New York, she was already gone. Her instincts told her before the news did. She packed their money, their ledgers, and a single pistol and vanished before dawn. Alberto followed her a week later. They fled back to Colombia, to Medellín, under the cover of darkness. Two ghosts returning home with pockets full of American money and hearts full of ambition. But something had changed. Griselda was no longer a girl, no longer a thief, no longer a lover following someone else's plan. She had tasted the new world and realized she belonged not in its shadows but above them. As the plane descended over Colombia, she looked down at the lights of Medellín, familiar, trembling, waiting. Alberto reached for her hand. She let him just for a moment. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains, the same way it always had before her life changed. She smiled faintly. "Let them chase ghosts," she murmured. "I'll build an empire." When Griselda returned to Medellín, the city was no longer the one she had left behind. The air was heavier. The money flowed faster. And the men who ran things were no longer the loud, boastful thieves she once worked beside. They were businessmen now, men who wore Italian suits, drank imported whiskey and built empires from shadows. It was a new world. And she was built for it. Medellín had become the beating heart of a growing storm. Planes came and went from private airstrips hidden in the mountains. Factories that once made textiles now processed white powder. Every street had a rumor, and every rumor led to money. Griselda moved quietly at first. She and Alberto Bravo bought a house in a wealthy neighborhood, a mansion with a white iron gate and guards at every corner. The neighbors thought they were legitimate entrepreneurs. In a way they were. Their product just happened to be the most addictive dream ever made. They began with a single lab, small, discreet, tucked inside a farm near Envigado. Alberto handled logistics. Griselda handled loyalty. She paid well, but she punished better. Workers who stole even a gram vanished. Couriers who talked disappeared between cities. The message spread quickly: she was not to be tested. By 1972, her network stretched across Colombia. Cocaine left Medellín by plane, by boat, by truck. It landed in Miami, New York, Los Angeles, and money flowed back like a river of silver. For every shipment that arrived, 5 more were planned. She didn't just sell cocaine, she manufactured demand. Nightclubs in Manhattan, high society parties in Beverly Hills. People whispered her name without even knowing who she was. Her fortune grew faster than she could count it. She bought houses with marble floors and chandeliers. Imported cars lined her driveway. Her closets overflowed with diamonds and fur. But the luxury wasn't vanity, it was armor. Every piece of gold, every silk dress, every car was a signal to the men around her. I am your equal, or your executioner. Miami became her kingdom. She began traveling there frequently, setting up warehouses, recruiting local dealers, paying off customs officers and police. Her couriers, mulas as she called them, were mostly women, single mothers, desperate souls willing to risk everything for a few $100s. She treated them like soldiers. They called her La Madrina, the Godmother. Violence was a language she spoke fluently. When a shipment was stolen near Cartagena, she didn't wait for explanations. She flew back, walked into the suspect's house unannounced, and shot him at his dinner table, while his wife and children watched. Afterward, she told her bodyguards to finish their meal. Business shouldn't ruin appetite, she said. Stories like that spread fast. Fear became her currency, and soon she was richer than all her rivals combined. The men who had once mocked the idea of a woman in their trade now kissed her ring. She financed other dealers, demanded cuts from smaller operations, and installed her loyalists across both continents. If someone wanted to move cocaine through Miami, they paid her first, or bled for it later. Yet for all her power, she lived with paranoia. She slept with a gun under her pillow and guards at her door. She trusted no one, not even Alberto. Their relationship had turned cold, infected by suspicion and ambition. He accused her of hoarding money, she accused him of betrayal. Neither was wrong. Both were dangerous. At night, she'd walk through her mansion barefoot, the marble cold under her feet, the silence broken only by distant thunder. Sometimes she would stop in front of a mirror, stare at her reflection and smile without warmth. She had everything: money, power, fear. But she had also built a cage. Every friend was a potential traitor. Every lover, a liability. Every day was borrowed time. One evening in Miami, during a party that glowed with champagne and neon, an American businessman approached her. He'd heard rumors of the Colombian woman who owned the city. He offered to buy from her directly, promising millions. She listened, nodded, and later that night had him followed. 2 days later, his body was found in a canal. No one ever discovered who ordered it. But in Miami's underworld, the message was clear. You don't negotiate with the Godmother, you obey. Still, even power needs allies. Griselda began forming connections with figures who would later become infamous themselves. Carlos Letter, Pablo Escobar, José Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha. At first they were just names, young men trying to break into her world. She saw their hunger and recognized it. But she also knew hunger could turn to rebellion. And rebellion was always answered with death. She gave them lessons wrapped in warnings. Ambition without fear is suicide, she told one. Loyalty without profit is slavery, she told another. They listened. They learned. Some would later imitate her methods. Others would try to erase her. But in those early days they all called her Dona Griselda, the matriarch of Medellín's shadow empire. By 1975 she controlled more of Miami's drug trade than any man alive. Her fortune was estimated in tens of millions, though no one could count the real number. Her rivals had either been bought, broken, or buried. Even the American DEA agents assigned to her case spoke of her with a kind of dark fascination. She's not like the others, one said in an interview. She doesn't run from power, she is power. And yet, the higher she climbed, the more unstable she became. The blood on her hands no longer haunted her dreams, it fueled them. She began ordering executions for insults, imagined or real. A maid who broke a vase was fired at gunpoint. A courier who came back late never came back again. Her cruelty became legend. On her 40th birthday, she threw a party in a Miami mansion overlooking Biscayne Bay. The guests included politicians, celebrities, and killers dressed in silk. Fireworks lit the night sky while music thumped through the walls. At midnight, someone toasted to La Madrina. Griselda raised her glass, eyes glinting in the candlelight. To loyalty, she said. And somewhere behind her, thunder cracked. Outside, the waves shimmered under the moon. Inside, the queen of cocaine smiled, surrounded by beauty and death, her two most faithful companions. Miami was never meant to sleep. Even before the cocaine, the city pulsed like a fever dream. Ocean breeze carrying perfume and gasoline, the nightclubs pulsing under neon lights, and money changing hands faster than the tide could turn. By 1976, Miami was no longer a vacation town. It was a kingdom. And its queen ruled from the shadows. Griselda Blanco had arrived quietly as always. No headlines, no grand entrance, just a woman stepping off a plane with a suitcase and a storm following behind her. The city didn't know it yet, but it was about to belong to her. She bought a mansion in Coconut Grove. White walls, palm trees bending over a blue pool, the kind of place built to hide sins in sunlight. From there she built her empire. Shipments from Medellín poured in weekly, hidden in furniture, clothing, and the bellies of couriers. She had men stationed at every airport, every port, every warehouse worth guarding. The money was impossible to count. Stacks of cash filled closets, car trunks, and even entire rooms. When she couldn't launder it fast enough, she buried it in walls. Every dollar that passed through Miami streets seemed to whisper her name, La Madrina. Her world ran on precision and paranoia. She trusted no one completely. Her inner circle included only those she could control through loyalty or fear, sometimes both. Her bodyguards were ex-soldiers, loyal until their last breath. Her lieutenants were men twice her size who bowed their heads when she entered a room. At her core, though, Griselda preferred order to chaos. She kept ledgers like a banker, budgets like a corporation. Her business moved like a machine, ruthless, efficient, clean. And yet, beneath the elegance there was blood. Always blood. When rivals challenged her routes, she answered in kind. Gunfire became Miami's soundtrack. Shootouts erupted in parking lots, restaurants, even in broad daylight on Coral Way. Bodies appeared in cars, floating in canals, or slumped against walls. The newspapers called it the cocaine cowboy era. The police called it a crisis. Griselda called it competition. She loved the city the way she loved danger, recklessly. Her favorite time was just before dawn, when the streets were empty, the ocean mist creeping through the palms. She'd walk out onto her balcony, barefoot, a glass of rum in her hand, and watch the lights of Miami shimmer like jewels scattered across black water. In those moments she looked almost peaceful. But her mind never rested. She was always planning. New routes, new connections, new ways to outsmart men who underestimated her simply because she was a woman. And oh, how they underestimated her. They called her La Madrina, now the Godmother. It was both a title and a warning. She was known for her elegance. The white suits, the gold jewelry, the calm voice that could order death with the same tone used to request champagne. Her meetings were more like ceremonies. Cigarette smoke, crystal glasses, men leaning forward, waiting for her to speak. She rarely raised her voice. She didn't need to. In Miami's underworld, her silence was more terrifying than anyone's threats. Her personal life, if it could be called that, was a tangle of power and loneliness. She had lovers, politicians, smugglers, even American businessmen, but none who lasted. Everyone eventually disappointed her. Or she disappointed them. At home, she surrounded herself with her sons, Dixon, Uber, Osvaldo, grooming them like princes of a dynasty no country would recognize. They learned her rules early: trust no one, lie well, kill cleanly. The boys adored her, feared her, and carried her ambition like a curse. Sometimes late at night, she'd watch them sleep and wonder if she'd damn them before they ever had a chance to choose their path. Then she'd light another cigarette and tell herself it didn't matter. The world never gave her mercy, why should she give it back? By 1977, Griselda's empire reached into every corner of America. From Miami's beaches to the penthouses of New York, her cocaine flowed like water. Every gram sold in the U.S. was in some way touched by her hand. Her profits dwarfed entire corporations. She laundered money through real estate, jewelry stores, even fake travel agencies. And yet, for all her power, something inside her was beginning to rot. It wasn't guilt, she'd buried that long ago. It was paranoia. She started noticing eyes everywhere, in mirrors, in crowds, in the faces of her own men. Whispers of betrayal haunted her halls. A courier late by an hour might not survive the night. A rumor of disloyalty was as deadly as a bullet. Her empire was immaculate from the outside, but inside, it was bleeding. The DA had begun to circle. Informants traded names for safety. Her partners in Colombia grew restless, tired of her control. Even Alberto Bravo, the man who once stood beside her, began questioning her judgment. He complained she'd become too reckless, too violent. She said he'd grown weak. Every argument between them sounded like a prelude to war. Still, for a time they pretended. Publicly they were a power couple, elegant, untouchable, the king and queen of Miami's underworld. But behind closed doors, their love was turning into something sharp and poisonous. The empire they built together had grown too large for two rulers. And in Griselda's world, there could only be one. She continued to live like royalty: lavish parties, imported champagne, diamonds glittering under chandeliers. She threw one party on her mansion's terrace to celebrate $1 million shipment that had landed safely. As fireworks exploded over the bay, someone asked her what it felt like to be the richest woman in Miami. Griselda laughed. "Rich?" she said, her accent cutting through the music. "No, Carino. I'm not rich. I'm necessary." The year 1979 would test that. Rivals from Colombia began encroaching on her Miami routes. Younger men, ambitious, ruthless, hungry, whispered that the godmother's reign was slipping. One of them, a trafficker named Rivi, told a journalist, "She's too violent. Too unpredictable. Her time is ending." That same week, his car exploded outside his home. His wife survived. He didn't. The message was clear. Griselda Blanco wasn't fading. She was reminding everyone she was still the storm. But storms burn out. And as the decade turned, cracks began to form beneath her empire's marble floors. The DA tightened its grip. Her sons grew reckless. Her enemies multiplied. And the man closest to her, Alberto Bravo, would soon become her next ghost. For now, though, the godmother of Miami still reigned. The city glittered under her shadow, a paradise built on fear. Every deal, every dollar, every bullet ran through her hands. And when she looked out over the bay at night, waves shining under moonlight, thunder rolling in the distance, she smiled. Because for one perfect, impossible moment, the world was exactly what she wanted it to be. Hers. By 1980, Miami had become a battlefield disguised as a paradise. From the air, it looked like heaven: oceanfront mansions, palm trees bending in soft wind, sunlight glinting off 100 yachts. But on the ground, it smelled of gunpowder and fear. Cocaine had turned the city into an empire of ghosts. Bodies were found daily, in cars, alleys, canals. Headlines spoke of shootouts in malls, assassinations in broad daylight, children caught in crossfire. And at the heart of that chaos, ruling like a queen over a city bleeding money, stood Griselda Blanco. But even queens bleed when love becomes a weapon. Her relationship with Alberto Bravo had always been a strange war, half passion, half strategy. He was the only man she'd ever considered her equal, the only one she'd ever allowed near the throne. Together, they'd built an empire worth tens of millions. Together, they'd corrupted half of Miami. But money has a way of making loyalty rot. At first, the changes were small. Alberto started taking separate meetings. He began to keep ledgers Griselda wasn't allowed to see. When she questioned him, he smiled that soft, patient smile, the one that had charmed her years ago. "You worry too much," he said. And for the first time in her life she did. Griselda had survived betrayal before. But this one felt different, not because it surprised her but because it hurt. Rumors reached her through whispers in nightclubs and backrooms. Alberto was moving shipments behind her back, hiding profits, cutting deals in Bogotá without her approval. Worse, someone claimed he'd spoken of leaving her entirely, taking his share of the fortune and disappearing to Europe with another woman. Griselda didn't believe in ghosts. She made them. One evening she called him to her Miami mansion. The rain was falling hard, drumming on the glass like 1,000 small warnings. She sat in her silk robe, cigarette glowing in the dim light. When Alberto walked in, he looked exhausted, the way men look when they've already made a decision they can't undo. "You've been busy," she said, her voice calm. He poured himself a drink. "Someone has to keep the business moving," he said. She tilted her head. "Without me." He didn't answer. For a long time they just stared at each other, two wolves too proud to blink. Then Griselda smiled. "If you're stealing from me, at least have the courage to admit it." Alberto laughed quietly. "You think you own me?" She stubbed out her cigarette. "I own everything I pay for." He left without another word. Outside the thunder rolled. The storm had found its shape. Days later they agreed to meet, one final time, to settle accounts. The place was a parking lot behind a nightclub in Bogotá, neutral ground. The night was thick with humidity and the smell of exhaust. Griselda arrived first, dressed in white from head to toe, linen suit, pearls, heels that clicked like gunfire on the wet pavement. She stood beneath a flickering light, calm as a saint at her own funeral. When Alberto's car pulled up, two men stepped out with him. He looked older than she remembered. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe it was just the last thing a man feels before dying. "Let's talk," he said. She nodded, and for a moment they looked almost peaceful, a husband and wife discussing business, not betrayal. But in their world, business was betrayal. No one knows exactly who fired first. Some say Alberto drew his gun. Others say Griselda pulled hers before he even blinked. What is certain is that by the time the echo faded, Alberto Bravo lay dead, a dark bloom spreading beneath him on the wet concrete. Griselda stood over his body, breathing slowly, gun still warm in her hand. Her white suit was splattered red. She didn't flinch. She simply whispered something in Spanish, words no one caught, and walked back to her car. The men who'd come with Alberto didn't move. They knew better. The Queen had just executed her king. By dawn she was back in Miami. The flight attendant noticed the blood on her cuff and said nothing. Griselda sipped champagne the whole way home, staring out at the clouds. When the plane landed, she smiled, a small, private smile that didn't reach her eyes. From that day forward, the legend began. They said she had killed her lover with her own gun, in high heels, under a flickering light. They said she buried him in a secret grave, then threw a party that same night. They said she laughed when she heard the police call it a domestic dispute. The stories multiplied, twisting into myth. She never confirmed or denied any of them. Every rumor added another layer to her armor. She had become untouchable. In Miami her power only grew. With Alberto gone, there was no one left to question her authority. She took over his routes, his contacts, his men. She even took his favorite watch, a gold Rolex he'd once refused to lend her, and wore it as her own. When people asked where Alberto was, she would smile and say, "He took a long trip." The empire thrived, but something in her changed. The grief she refused to feel hardened into cruelty. She trusted no one. She started carrying two guns at all times, one for business, one for love, and sometimes she forgot which was which. At night, she'd walk through her mansion, barefoot on marble floors, the sound of the ocean echoing through the windows. Her reflection followed her from room to room, silent, accusing. She'd pour herself a drink and raise it toward the glass. "To loyalty," she'd whisper. And then she'd drink alone. By 1981, Miami was fully hers. Every dealer, every enforcer, every crooked cop knew her name. Even the DA spoke of her with reluctant awe. "She's like smoke," one agent said. "She's everywhere and nowhere." But power, like love, is a dangerous thing to believe in. The more she controlled, the more fragile it became. Her sons were growing reckless. Her enemies were gathering. And somewhere in Colombia, new men were rising, younger, hungrier, less patient. Griselda didn't see them yet. She was still looking backward, at the ghost of a man she had loved enough to kill. In her world, death wasn't an ending. It was the cost of staying alive. Miami had forgotten what silence sounded like. By 1981, the city woke each morning to the crack of gunfire and the wail of sirens. News anchors spoke of narco shootouts, the way weather reporters spoke of rain. It wasn't unusual anymore. It was routine. Cocaine ruled everything, the banks, the police, the politicians. And above it all, like a phantom in gold and white, Griselda Blanco watched her kingdom burn and bloom at once. She had won the war for Miami, but peace was never in her nature. Power to her was not something you kept. It was something you proved again and again with blood. Her lieutenants called her La Madrina. The Americans called her the Godmother. To her enemies she was simply death with a smile. Griselda had transformed the city into a theater of terror. When rivals refused to pay tribute, she didn't negotiate, she annihilated. Assassins on motorcycles became her signature. They'd pull up beside a car in traffic, 2 men in helmets, 2 quick shots, and ride off before the light turned green. Bodies fell in broad daylight, blood painting the palm-lined streets. The newspapers coined the term, the cocaine cowboys. They didn't know that their queen had written the script. The killings became a kind of language, each one a message, a warning, a claim. A club owner who skimmed profits found his nightclub burned to ash. A courier who talked to the DA vanished, his car found empty by the marina. A rival who mocked her in a bar was shot the next morning, while his breakfast was still warm. Griselda didn't need to be present. Her word was law, carried out by men who feared her more than death. To cross her was to erase yourself. But violence is never a one-way street. For every man she killed, another rose to take his place. New cartels were forming, slicker, younger, more organized. Men like Pablo Escobar and Carlos Letter were turning cocaine into an industry. They respected Griselda, but they didn't worship her. And respect in her world was never enough. Inside her mansion, her paranoia grew. She no longer held meetings at home. She spoke through intermediaries, changed cars daily, and slept in different rooms every night. Even her guards weren't sure where she was at any given hour. She had built a labyrinth of fear, and she lived at its center. Her sons were growing restless. Dixon and Uber fought constantly over control. Osvaldo, the youngest, tried to prove himself by orchestrating killings without her approval. Griselda saw it all with quiet contempt. They were ambitious, yes, but reckless. They wanted to be kings in a kingdom she hadn't finished building. One night, during dinner, she slammed her glass down and said, "You think I did all this so you could play God? You don't even understand what God is." No one answered. They didn't have to. The fear in their eyes told her they finally did. The DA, meanwhile, was closing in. They'd been watching her for years, tracing bank accounts, intercepting phone calls, interrogating couriers. But Griselda stayed untouchable. She moved faster than bureaucracy, smarter than paperwork. Still, the circle was tightening. Her operations were too large, her enemies too many, her name too famous. Every shooting, every explosion, every headline whispered the same thing: her time is coming. But she didn't slow down. If anything, she accelerated. In 1981, a massacre changed everything. It began at a small liquor store in Dadeland Mall, an ordinary afternoon in Miami. 2 men in ski masks stormed in with machine guns, shouting in Spanish. Within seconds, the floor was covered in glass and blood. When it was over, 6 people were dead. The attackers vanished before the police arrived. The papers called it the Dadeland Massacre. The police called it a declaration of war. Everyone else called it exactly what it was: Griselda Blanco's warning to Miami. She had unleashed chaos not as a weapon but as policy. Fear, she knew, was the only true loyalty. The killings drew heat but also awe. To her followers, she was mythic, a woman who commanded armies of men, who could make an entire city tremble without ever raising her voice. They told stories of her cruelty as if they were miracles. How she once had a man executed because he looked at her the wrong way. How she sent a rival's wife a box of roses, and inside, a single bullet. She became more than a queen. She became a god. But gods are lonely. And madness is the price of divinity. By 1982, Griselda rarely slept. When she did, her dreams were filled with the dead, Alberto, her enemies, nameless men shot in her name. She'd wake to the sound of rain and reach for the pistol beside her pillow before realizing she was alone. Her empire was still strong, but the foundation was cracking. Too many bodies. Too many eyes watching. Too many sons growing bold and foolish. She began to talk of leaving, of escaping back to Colombia or maybe somewhere no one knew her. But Miami wouldn't let her go. It was the one city that had truly understood her, ruthless, beautiful, addicted to its own reflection. Then came the betrayals. A lieutenant flipped to the DA. A courier was arrested with a ledger in his car. For the first time, her name appeared in official reports, tied directly to murders, shipments, and accounts. She knew what it meant. The storm she had built was finally turning back toward her. Still, she refused to show weakness. When her advisors begged her to flee, she said calmly, "I started this city. If it wants to eat me, let it choke." By the end of 1983, the war had consumed everything. Miami streets were quieter, but only because everyone left alive was afraid to make noise. The DA had tripled its task forces. The cartels were shifting power back to Colombia. The cocaine cowboy era was ending, in fire, in silence, in exhaustion. And at the center of it, surrounded by the ghosts she had made, stood Griselda Blanco. Her empire was smaller, but her legend had never been larger. She'd built Miami with bullets and dreams, and now, as it burned, she was watching it vanish with the same cold fascination she once reserved for sunsets. One night, standing on her balcony overlooking Biscayne Bay, she whispered to herself, "Every empire ends in the hands of its children." She wasn't wrong. The next war would come from within her own bloodline. But for now, the queen still stood. Miami was quiet, for the first time in years. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before an arrest. Miami woke to the sound of helicopters. The city that once danced to the rhythm of gunfire now trembled under the hum of federal engines. By 1984, the cocaine cowboys era was collapsing. The war was over, and its queen was about to be crowned in chains. For years, Griselda Blanco had seemed untouchable. She'd survived betrayals, assassinations, even love. Her name had become myth, whispered in fear, printed in headlines, studied by men who wanted to be her and destroyed by those who tried. But even myths bleed when the world stops believing. The DA had been watching her for months. Every phone call, every courier, every shipment. They built their case in silence, like sculptors chipping away at a monument. And when the shape finally revealed itself, it was Griselda's face staring back at them, calm, perfect, deadly. She knew it was coming. In her world, the end never arrived as a surprise. It came slowly, the way winter creeps into a tropical city, cold at first only at night. The first sign was money that didn't arrive. Then couriers who didn't come home. Then the silence. Her phone stopped ringing. Her men stopped looking her in the eye. Even her sons, restless and reckless, began vanishing into the fog of their own ambitions. Griselda sat in her Miami mansion, surrounded by empty chairs and unopened letters. Outside, rain tapped against the glass. It always came back to the rain. She lit a cigarette, took a drag, and whispered to no one, "Empires don't fall. They rot." The DA called it Operation Banshee. A name chosen for irony, a woman's scream in the dark heralding death. Fitting for the woman they called La Madrina. It began before dawn on a humid February morning. 50 agents moved through Coconut Grove like shadows, radios whispering, boots crunching gravel. They surrounded her mansion in silence. A dog barked once, then stopped. When they broke through the front door, she was waiting. No panic. No resistance. Just Griselda Blanco sitting at her dining table in a silk robe, a cigarette burning between her fingers. Her bodyguards were gone. Her sons were nowhere to be found. The lead agent shouted, "Federal agents! You're under arrest." She exhaled smoke and smiled faintly. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten me," she said. They found stacks of cash behind the walls, weapons in every room, and ledgers written in a code only she could read. One agent later said he'd never seen anything like it. The precision, the arrogance, the calm. She didn't look scared, he recalled. She looked bored. When they cuffed her hands, she didn't resist. She asked for her purse instead. Inside was a small gold cross, a pistol, and a note with a single word written in Spanish, "Siempre." Always. As they led her outside, the flash of cameras lit the rain-slicked driveway. The world finally saw her face, the dark eyes, the faint smile, the queen without a throne. To some she looked defeated. To others, immortal. Her trial was a spectacle. Reporters packed the courtroom. Artists sketched her profile like she was royalty. She arrived each day dressed impeccably, pressed suits, pearls, red lipstick. If they expected shame, they never found it. The prosecution listed her crimes in endless detail. Trafficking, conspiracy, dozens of murders. Each charge carried enough years to bury her alive. She listened without expression, only occasionally turning to whisper something to her lawyer, who sweated more than she did. When witnesses testified against her, former lovers, couriers, lieutenants, she smiled at them. The kind of smile that says, You'll never sleep again. One courier began trembling mid-testimony, claiming he saw her eyes follow him like a curse. The judge called for order. Griselda leaned back unfazed. It wasn't magic. It was memory. She lived in their nightmares because she'd built them. Outside the courthouse, the press called her the Black Widow, the cocaine godmother, the queenpin of Miami. To them she was a headline. To the DA she was a trophy. To herself, she was still a businesswoman whose only mistake was trusting men to count. In private interviews she denied everything. I sold nothing, she said. I only knew people who sold. When asked about the violence, she laughed softly. Violence? She repeated. That was Miami, not me. But everyone in that room, the agents, the lawyers, even the stenographer, knew that Miami had been her reflection. The verdict came down after months of spectacle. Guilty on multiple counts. 20 years in federal prison. The courtroom erupted with whispers and flashes of cameras. Griselda stood, hands clasped, spine straight. When the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she nodded slowly. Only this, she said, her voice calm and almost tender. You think this ends with me? It doesn't. You've cut down a tree, not the forest. The room went silent. Even the judge hesitated before calling for order. In prison she adjusted quickly. Routine suited her. She ran the cell block like a corporation, managing favors, debts, alliances. The guards called her Señora Blanco. The other inmates called her Ma. Everyone respected her. At night, in her cell, she would lie awake listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of laughter. The walls smelled of bleach and hopelessness. She didn't mind. She had always lived in cages, some gilded, some concrete. This was just another one. Still, sometimes she dreamed of the sea. The sound of waves crashing against Cartagena's shores. The rain falling on the tin roof of her childhood home. And in those dreams she wasn't La Madrina or the godmother. She was just the barefoot girl who once ran through puddles and thought the world could be hers. Years later, when asked in an interview whether she regretted anything, she smiled faintly. Regret, she said. Of course. I regret that I didn't charge more. The room erupted in nervous laughter. But she wasn't joking. By 1985, the woman who once ruled Miami sat behind bars in a federal facility in California. The empire was gone. The money was scattered. The city had moved on. But in the quiet corners of its streets, under the hum of neon, people still whispered her name. Because queens don't die when they fall. They linger, in stories, in fear, in memory. And in that sense, La Madrina still ruled Miami. Even from her cage. There are two kinds of prisons. The one they build for you, and the one you build for yourself. Griselda Blanco had lived in both long before the bars ever closed behind her. By 1986, she was 43 years old. Her face had softened, but her eyes hadn't. Time had dulled her edges, not her instincts. She could still smell fear, even here where everyone was supposed to be equal. Federal prison wasn't designed for queens. The walls were painted in dull colors meant to erase identity, the air carried the tang of disinfectant and despair. But Griselda treated it like a new business. She studied the system, its hierarchy, its economy. She learned who controlled the cigarettes, who controlled the drugs, who controlled the guards. Within months she controlled all three. They called her La Señora. Even in beige prison clothes, she carried herself with the calm authority of someone who once ordered death with a whisper. The guards nodded to her in the halls. The inmates moved aside. No one questioned how she managed to get better food, better bedding, better silence. She had traded palaces for concrete, but her crown was invisible and permanent. Still the nights were long. That's when the ghosts came. Alberto. The boy in Cartagena. The men she'd loved, betrayed, or buried. Sometimes she'd see their faces in the dark, faint outlines etched by the dim fluorescent glow. They never spoke. They didn't need to. When she closed her eyes, she could hear Miami, gunshots under thunder, waves slapping against the docks, the faint hum of wealth and sin. Dreams were the only place she was free, and even there, freedom felt like punishment. Her sons wrote letters at first. Dixon and Uber sent postcards from Colombia, coded with affection and anxiety. Osvaldo called her when he could, his voice still sharp, still young. They told her everything was fine. She knew they were lying. Slowly the letters stopped. Rumors reached her instead, smuggled through whispers between guards and inmates. Dixon shot in Medellín. Uber gunned down in Colombia. Osvaldo, the last one, murdered outside a nightclub in Bogotá. 3 sons. 3 ghosts. All gone before her. The news didn't make her cry. She just sat on her cot, staring at the floor, cigarette trembling slightly in her hand. God has a sense of humor, she murmured. Then she laughed, and it echoed off the iron walls like breaking glass. Years bled together. Her body began to betray her. Her hands shook when she lit a match. Her knees ached from the cold. Her breath grew shallow, her temper shorter. But her mind stayed sharp. She read constantly, Bibles, business books, old newspapers. Sometimes she'd underline phrases that amused her. Blessed are the meek. She circled that one, then wrote beside it, lies. Other inmates came to her for advice. Some wanted protection. Others wanted forgiveness. She gave them both for a price. Her empire had shrunk to the size of a cell block, but even that was still hers. In 1989, a journalist from the Miami Herald wrote to her, asking for an interview. He wanted to know if she felt responsible for the violence that had consumed the city. She replied with a short note written in perfect cursive. Violence was already there. I just gave it a reason to wear high heels. The letter became infamous. It was quoted in newspapers, documentaries, and movies. Her myth only grew, even as she sat behind bars. People still spoke her name in Miami's underworld, half in awe, half in fear. To some, she was a monster. To others, a pioneer. To herself, she was both. Time, she realized, was the only undefeated enemy. Every year stole something from her, a son, a memory, a piece of her power. She started to pray again, though she wasn't sure to whom. Maybe to the Virgin. Maybe to the void. Maybe to herself. In the prison chapel, she'd sit in the back row, eyes half closed, while other women sang hymns. Her lips didn't move. Her prayers were silent. They weren't for forgiveness. They were for remembrance. To be remembered was, in its own way, to live forever. Sometimes she'd get letters from strangers, admirers, imitators, even young women who called her Madre. They asked how she'd done it, how she'd built so much from nothing. She never answered. There was no blueprint for madness. No recipe for survival. Only instinct, and the will to outlive your enemies. By 1994, the prison walls began to feel like the world's last honest place. The guards trusted her. The inmates feared her. And the outside, the empire, the money, the chaos, all of it had dissolved into stories. One evening, as the sun bled through the narrow window above her bunk, she whispered, I gave them a city, and they gave me a cage. Then she smiled faintly. It wasn't regret. It was pride. Because even in that cage her name still meant something. A few months later she received news of her upcoming release. Early parole for good behavior. The irony wasn't lost on her. She packed slowly, a few photos, a Bible, a cigarette lighter. When the guard came to collect her, he asked if she was ready. Griselda looked around the cell one last time, at the walls that had watched her sleep, at the ghosts that had kept her company. I've been ready for 20 years, she said. When the gates opened, the world had changed. Griselda Blanco stepped out of prison into a sun she hadn't felt in 2 decades. It was softer than she remembered, not the golden blaze of Miami, but the pale light of a fading afternoon. She was older now. Her hair had turned gray at the edges, her hands carried the tremor of years. But her walk was steady. Even age knew better than to touch her pride. A guard escorted her to the exit. You have family? He asked, not unkindly. Griselda smiled faintly. Once. And then she left. Colombia had forgotten her name, or at least pretended to. The Medellín she returned to wasn't the same city she'd once ruled from afar. The streets were cleaner, the soldiers younger, and the faces harder. The cartels she helped inspire had been replaced by others. New logos, new legends, same blood. She took a small house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. Nothing grand. 2 rooms, a courtyard, a lime tree in the back. Her neighbors thought she was just another old woman selling clothes at the market. She let them think so. She opened a modest dress shop. She named it La Madrina Boutique. No one questioned it. To most, it sounded like a grandmother's joke. To her, it was irony made flesh. Every morning, she rose before dawn. She'd sweep the floor, boil water for coffee, open the shop, and wait. She sold dresses to school teachers, brides, and teenage girls dreaming of better lives. They liked her, the quiet senora with polite eyes and stories that always ended in laughter. They didn't know the hands that measured their waist had once signed death orders. They didn't know the voice that asked about fabric had once commanded empires. And yet, sometimes when she caught her reflection in the shop window, she saw the shadow of La Madrina staring back, the one who had owned Miami, who had rewritten the laws of fear. That woman was still there, just buried under wrinkles and silence. She heard the old names again, Escobar, Gotcha, Letter, whispered on radios printed in history books. Men who had died long before her but still haunted the country like unburied kings. She would smirk when she heard their stories. They learned from me, she'd mutter. They just had better PR. Sometimes, journalists came asking questions. They had found her somehow, these young men and women too young to remember who she really was. They came with recorders and notebooks asking about the old days. She'd smile, pour them coffee and lie with grace. I was a businesswoman, she'd say. That's all. And when they left, she'd lock the door and laugh until she coughed. At night, the city hummed beneath her window. Motorcycles, laughter, the faint beat of reggaeton bleeding from bars. She'd sit in a rocking chair, a cigarette between her fingers, eyes half closed. The smoke curled up like prayer. Sometimes she'd talk to her sons, to Alberto, to the ghosts who'd followed her home. Her voice was calm, affectionate, tired. You see, she'd whisper. The world moved on. But we're still here. There were days she felt free and days she felt forgotten. She didn't know which was worse. In 2006, a local boy, a teenager with sharp eyes and restless hands, began helping her at the shop. He reminded her of herself. Poor, clever, dangerous in ways he didn't yet understand. She taught him how to sew, how to sell, how to keep secrets. When he asked why she never went to church, she said, "Because God doesn't visit people like me." The boy laughed, thinking it was a joke. She didn't. As the years passed, her health declined. The tremor in her hands grew worse, her steps slowed. She rarely left the neighborhood. Still, people greeted her with respect, a small nod, a polite smile. They didn't know why they feared her, only that they did. Some things you can't hide no matter how old you get. One afternoon, she walked to the butcher's market. It was a Sunday. The sky was hot and white, the air thick with dust and laughter. She bought pork ribs, chatted briefly with the vendor, and stepped outside. The sound that followed was small, almost gentle. 2 clicks, 2 cracks, a whisper of finality. A motorcycle sped away. The fruit vendor screamed. The ribs fell from her hands. Griselda Blanco collapsed in the street, her blood pooling on the concrete, warm against the afternoon sun. The city did not stop for her. People ran, shouted, crossed themselves. Within minutes, the police arrived. Within hours, the headlines did too. Cocaine godmother assassinated in Medellín. The irony was almost beautiful. The woman who had invented death on motorcycles had met her own in the same way. Her funeral was quiet. A handful of neighbors attended. No family. No flowers except for one bouquet of white lilies sent anonymously. The card attached read only, Siempre. Always. For weeks afterward, the market smelled of gunpowder and rain. People whispered her name in disbelief. Some said justice had finally come. Others said justice had nothing to do with it. In the end, Medellín absorbed her like it did all its ghosts. The city she helped create had come to collect its debt. But in the humid silence of her little shop, the dresses still hung in rows, delicate, colorful, untouched. And on the door the faded sign remained. La Madrina Boutique. The queen had fallen. The legend had not. The morning was ordinary. The kind of quiet, sun-baked Sunday that made even the city's ghosts seem lazy. Medellín shimmered under a white sky, the heat pressed down on the streets like a hand. Vendors unpacked crates of fruit, the smell of mango and diesel mingled in the air, and an old radio played a love song from another century. Griselda Blanco stepped out of her house wearing a pale blue dress. Her granddaughter walked beside her, holding her hand. The girl's laughter was high and bright, the kind of sound that still belonged to the world. It had been years since Griselda had felt like part of that world. But she still went to the butcher's every Sunday. Habit was the only religion she had left. They walked slowly down the cracked sidewalk, past stray dogs sleeping in the shade and neighbors who nodded politely without daring to meet her eyes. She was 70 years old now, though she didn't seem fragile. There was still a command in her posture, a quiet authority that hadn't eroded with time. The city had changed, she hadn't. The butcher's shop smelled of metal and salt. The butcher himself, a kind man with tired eyes, greeted her with a smile that carried both warmth and caution. "Buenos dias, Dona Griselda," he said. She returned the smile. "The ribs as always." He wrapped them neatly in brown paper, placed them in a plastic bag and handed them to her. She paid in cash, exact change. As she turned to leave, a sound rose faintly above the hum of conversation, the sputter of a motorcycle engine approaching fast. She didn't flinch. It was a sound she had known all her life. The soundtrack of her empire, coming back for one final encore. 2 men. Helmets. Shadows and sunlight. They pulled up beside the market and for an instant, everything slowed. The girl tugged at her grandmother's sleeve, asking something about the weather. Griselda looked down at her, at those young, unscarred eyes, and smiled. It was small, almost invisible. But it was real. Then came the sound, soft, efficient, final. 2 shots. One to the head. One to the heart. The ribs fell from her hands, the paper splitting, blood mixing with meat. She crumpled onto the pavement, the world tilting sideways. The motorcycle vanished down the street, swallowed by the noise of traffic and life moving on. The crowd gathered. Someone screamed. Someone prayed. A man covered her body with a sheet that fluttered in the hot wind. Her granddaughter knelt beside her, shaking her, whispering "Abuela," over and over as if the word could undo fate. But Griselda Blanco was already gone. Finally, peacefully gone. Her face was calm, her lips still curved into the faintest smile, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. There was no fear, no surprise. Only recognition. The storm had found its way home. By evening the news spread. Cocaine godmother assassinated. The words repeated across television screens, newspapers, radios, a ghost story retold by those who never knew her. Commentators speculated. Old rivals were blamed. Some called it justice. Others called it irony. No one called it what it was, destiny. The woman who had invented death on motorcycles had met her own in the same way. The symmetry was almost poetic. Her body was taken to a small funeral home on the outskirts of the city. No guards. No reporters. Just silence and lilies. A few neighbors attended, standing awkwardly near the door. A priest read the rites. When it was done, a single bouquet was left beside her coffin. White roses and a card with one word written in delicate handwriting. Siempre. Always. Outside, the rain began again. A brief, warm drizzle that darkened the streets and made the city smell like metal and soil. It soaked through the cardboard awnings and ran in thin streams down the market's gutters. The same rain that had fallen in Cartagena, in Medellín, in Miami. The same rain that had followed her since the day she was born. Some said it was coincidence. Others fate. But those who had known her, or feared her, whispered that it was the world itself saying her name one last time. Griselda. And then, silence. She left behind no dynasty, no empire, no monuments. Only stories, half true, half myth, all hers. They would turn her into a movie, a legend, a warning. But the truth was simpler and sadder. She had loved power the way other people loved God, completely, blindly, desperately. And like all faiths built on fear, it had ended in a prayer whispered too late. Still, for all her sins, she had lived the way she wanted, absolutely. In the end, she was what she had always been. The barefoot girl from Cartagena. The ghost of Miami. The storm no one could outlast. And as the rain fell softly over Medellín that night, the city, her grave, her mirror, seemed to hold its breath. Because somewhere between thunder and silence, a legend had finally closed her eyes. The rain has never stopped. Not really. It just moves, from city to city, from memory to memory, following those who once thought they could outrun it. Tonight, it falls over Medellín. It slides down rusted gutters and cracked windows, taps against tin roofs and the leaves of mango trees. In a small market where blood once dried under the sun, it washes the last trace away. And in that sound, that endless, gentle percussion, her story continues to echo. They say legends die twice. First when the heart stops beating. Then when the world stops whispering their names. But some names refuse silence. They become weather. They become rain. Griselda Blanco was one of them. For half a century she walked through the world like a storm, barefoot in Cartagena, bold in Medellín, divine in Miami. Everywhere she went she built something out of nothing. A fortune, a kingdom, a myth. And when the world demanded payment she gave it blood. Her story isn't one of justice or redemption. It's a story about hunger, the kind that doesn't fade with money or years, the kind born from being told all your life that you are nothing. Griselda refused to be nothing. And that refusal cost her everything. Some remember her as a monster. Some as a pioneer. Both are true. Because monsters are often just pioneers who stopped apologizing. The city sleeps now but the rain keeps falling, soft, steady like breath. Inside every drop, there's an echo. A gunshot in Miami, a ship leaving Cartagena, a girl standing barefoot in a puddle, looking toward a horizon she cannot name. She's still out there, in a way, not in flesh but in the myth that refuses to die. Because in every city that breeds hunger and ambition, there will always be another Griselda waiting to learn the rules of the world, and then break them. The voice fades. The rain stays. Your breathing slows with it. Outside, thunder rolls across the mountains, not angry, just old. The kind of thunder that sounds like memory. You close your eyes. And in the dark, the story softens. She was born in the rain. She lived in the storm. She died under the same sky that raised her. And still, the rain keeps falling.